The bankers who secretly started WWI, the hidden history. We're told the bullets did it. But bullets are cheap compared to empires, and empires don't die from lead. They die from math, from the ledger, from balance sheets that can't breathe, from bankruptcy dressed up as patriotism. The popular story says Europe went mad with nationalism and stumbled into war. That is the bedtime version. The darker version is colder. Europe didn't choose war in 1914. Europe had been financing war for decades, and the accounts were due. They didn't lose peace. They ran out of cash, then called it destiny. Think about the word mobilization. It sounds like trains and soldiers, but it also means money moving, credit moving, gold moving. When the first troops marched, the real invasion had already happened. It was an invasion of debt into every capital city, crawling under every cabinet door. In London, the streets smelled like coal smoke and confidence. The pound was more than currency. It was a threat. It was a promise. It was a fist wrapped in paper. London's banks didn't just hold money. They held governments by the throat. In Paris, the cafes glittered and the boulevards shone. France looked like art and discipline. But the state's elegance was expensive, and elegance always hides invoices. Behind every chandelier was an accountant with ink-stained fingers. Behind every parade was a bond coupon waiting to be clipped. In Berlin, steel and pride marched together. Germany was young, sharp, and hungry. Its factories looked like cathedrals built for machines, but even machines need feeding. Coal, iron, copper, nitrates. War isn't a poem. War is a supply chain with a uniform. In Vienna, the empire still wore old jewelry. It carried centuries like heavy metals. The palaces were beautiful, but beauty doesn't pay interest. Austria-Hungary was a grand mansion with termites inside the beams. The music played louder to hide the cracking. In St. Petersburg, the Romanovs lived in a world of mirrors and fur. Russia looked infinite. But infinity is useless when your rail lines are thin and your treasury is leaking. An empire can have endless land and still be insolvent. Land does not equal liquidity. The illusion was majesty everywhere, gold braid, cavalry horses, brass bands, flags big enough to cover doubt. Europe looked like it could rule the planet forever. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting, and the rot was financial, because the truth is simple. A modern industrial war is a furnace. You don't win it with courage alone. You feed it with cash, gold, credit, and IOU stacked like firewood. And once you start feeding it, it never feels full. Before 1914, the great powers lived like gamblers who discovered a new trick. Borrow cheap, build ships, build guns, threaten the neighbor. Then borrow again to match the neighbor's response. The arms race wasn't just politics. It was an addiction, and debt was the needle. Debt is not an abstract thing in this story. Debt is a living monster. It grows when you sleep. It eats your tax revenue first. Then it eats your future. Then it eats your sovereignty. And it always whispers the same line. Just one more loan. Here is the trap. Under the gold standard, governments couldn't print freely. Gold was the leash. It made currency stable, but it also made war expensive in the only language that mattered. Gold meant limits. War meant breaking limits. So the bridge between them was credit, and the gatekeepers were bankers. Now introduce the real antagonist. Not a general, not a king. The bondholders, the syndicates, the merchant banks, the quiet committees who didn't need medals because they owned the factory that stamped them. They sat in paneled rooms that smelled like leather and cigar ash. They didn't shout. They didn't have to. They had the power to freeze credit like winter. They could starve a nation without firing a shot. They could make a government beg with a signature. By 1910, a new kind of strategy had matured. It wasn't about borders. It was about the global plumbing of finance. If you control the pipes, you control the water. If you control credit, you control time, because war is purchased in the present and paid for decades later. And somewhere in America, the new giant was waking up. The United States wasn't an empire of old castles. It was an empire of balance sheets, railroads, oil, and factories. It had what Europe was running out of: fresh capital, deep credit, and a public that still believed it could stay clean. So in November 1910, a strange little pilgrimage happens in the American dark. A private rail car. Men traveling quietly, names softened, stories prepared, hunting gear as theater. A secret meeting not because it was illegal, but because it was unpopular. The objective wasn't romance or conspiracy for its own sake. It was architecture, a machine, a system designed to turn private banking logic into national policy, a structure that could create credit quickly, coordinate liquidity, and calm panics that threaten the elite's fortunes. The Federal Reserve is often sold as a stabilizer. In this thriller, it is also a weapon. A weapon is any tool that expands what a state can do. The Fed expanded what America could finance, and financing is the skeleton key to modern war. When Europe slid toward conflict in 1914, it wasn't stepping off a cliff blindly. It was stepping onto a conveyor belt of obligations, alliances, and purchase orders. Steel producers, chemical firms, shipping insurers, grain exporters. Everyone had a stake. Now watch the spiral begin. In July 1914, after the assassination in Sarajevo, diplomacy collapses like a weak bridge. Telegrams fly, ultimatums land, mobilizations begin, and the first thing governments do before they even shoot is protect their gold. Let that sink in. Before the killing, they defend the vault, because everyone understands the same fear. If gold leaves, confidence leaves. If confidence leaves, the banking system shatters. And if the banking system shatters, the war ends in days, not years. So the first battles are financial. Banks close temporarily. Stock markets halt. Currencies tremble. The city of London, the heart of global finance, feels a pulse of panic. Not because of bullets, but because of liquidity. The rule of three hits like a hammer. The gold was leaving. The credit was freezing. The trade routes were choking. And yet armies were already on the move, which meant the burn rate had begun. Every day now had a price tag. Britain had the world's largest navy, but a navy doesn't pay for itself. France had pride, but pride doesn't buy shells. Germany had industry, but industry needs imported materials. Russia had manpower, but manpower eats bread. War expands, and every expansion is an invoice. Numbers start appearing like bloodstains. By the end of 1914, the cost curves are already obscene. Millions of men under arms, millions of rifles, billions of rounds. Artillery shells measured not in hundreds, but in millions. Each shell is metal, explosives, transport, wages, interest. And interest is the silent killer. Because war loans don't just demand repayment. They demand a premium for fear. The more desperate the borrower, the higher the rate. The more the rate rises, the faster insolvency approaches. It is drowning with a weight belt. Now look at the crucial hinge, American neutrality. In 1914, the U.S. claims it will stay out. But neutrality is fragile when your factories are humming, when your farmers are selling, when your banks are discovering that war creates perfect customers. Because a government at war is the best borrower on earth. It doesn't negotiate like a peacetime business. It doesn't ask, is this efficient? It asks, can you deliver by Thursday? And it will sign almost anything for certainty. So the money begins to flow. Loans, credits, purchase agreements, shipping contracts, insurance, letters of credit. The war isn't just fought in trenches. It is fought through ledgers and cables, across the Atlantic, in the language of collateral. A bank can't aim a rifle, but it can decide whether the rifle exists. That is the power. If you finance the supply chain, you finance the war's duration. You stretch conflict into years by feeding it oxygen. You don't need to start the fire if you own the fuel. By 1915, the machinery is running. America sells more goods to the Allied powers. American exports swell. Manufacturing accelerates. The U.S. economy tastes war profits without tasting war casualties. It is the cleanest kind of money, until it isn't, because then comes the trap within the trap. If a bank makes massive loans to one side, it becomes invested in that side's survival. Not morally, financially. If the borrower loses, the lender eats the loss. Suddenly, national interest aligns with the bank's balance sheet. Now the ledger starts steering the ship. If the Allies lose, the loans die. The collateral burns. The purchasing commissions stop. The paper profits vanish, so the pressure shifts. Subtle at first, editorials, advisors, policy whispers. The soft coercion of finance. Think about the scale of that. A loan is not just money. It's leverage. It's a rope tied around the borrower and the lender alike. Once the rope is tied, the lender starts pulling politics to protect repayment. That is not conspiracy. That is gravity. Meanwhile, Europe is bleeding gold. Britain and France sell overseas assets. They liquidate holdings. They scrape the barrel for collateral. By 1916, the war has eaten so much that even rich empires start to look like men pawning watches. Germany, under blockade, feels another kind of insolvency. Not just cash, but material, rubber, nitrates, food. A nation can be solvent on paper and starving in reality. And starvation is the final accountant. It counts calories, not coins. This is where the story turns noir, because the war becomes less about victory and more about avoiding default. The generals keep sending men over the top, but behind them, the finance ministries are staring at spreadsheets like death certificates. Somewhere in that fog sits a smoking gun moment, not a pistol, a document, a meeting, a negotiated line that changes fate. It is the moment when private credit becomes public obligation, when risk is transferred from bankers to taxpayers. Picture it like a foreclosure. The borrower can't pay. The lender threatens collapse. The state steps in, not to save the public, but to save the system that holds the public's money. The negotiation is brutal, even when spoken politely. The dialogue, paraphrased, sounds like this: we need funding to continue the war. Then you will guarantee repayment. At what cost? at the cost of your future taxes, and if we refuse, then the credit stops. This is liquidation logic. Everything gets a price. Even blood, even sovereignty, especially sovereignty, because sovereignty is solvency, and a state that cannot pay is a state that cannot choose. By early 1917, the situation sharpens. The Allied side needs more, but collateral is thin. The lender's exposure is huge. If the borrower collapses, the lender collapses with it. That is the moment the banker stops being a spectator. The banker becomes a participant. And then, in April 1917, America enters the war. The story sold to the public is flags and outrage and duty. Underneath, the ledger breathes out in relief, because now the debts can be socialized. Now repayment can be guaranteed by the full weight of the U.S. state. War bonds become the sacrament. Liberty loans, patriotic posters. Citizens urged to buy. It looks like unity. It is also refinancing. It is the conversion of private risk into public obligation, wrapped in red, white, and blue. The wear expands again. The furnace demands more fuel, steel, coal, ships, uniforms, trucks, rails, food, medical supplies. Every category becomes an industry. Every industry becomes a lobby, and the lobby becomes a voice in policy. This is the industrial heartbeat of the conflict. The factory owners want orders. The banks want repayment. The state wants victory. The soldier wants to go home alive. Only one of those desires is easily monetized, and it isn't the soldier's. Now we reach the climax, the default. It doesn't always look like a missed payment on a calendar. Sometimes it looks like bread riots. Sometimes it looks like a mutiny. Sometimes it looks like a monarchy dissolving overnight. Russia is the clearest example of money running out and society snapping. Years of strain, inflation, shortages, and incompetence turn hardship into rage. The state's authority evaporates, not because it lost a single battle, but because it lost control of supply. Germany's civilians feel hunger as a weapon. Blockade tightens. Substitutes replace food. Calories drop. Morale decays. A nation can endure casualties, but it cannot endure humiliation and hunger forever. The body keeps the books when the treasury lies. Austria-Hungary fractures like an over-leveraged company. Too many nationalities. Too few resources. Too much debt. The empire tries to keep paying dividends and loyalty, but the shareholders are starving. Bankruptcy becomes political secession. By late 1918, the killing stops. Armistice arrives. People celebrate as if peace is a moral triumph. But peace is also a financial event. It is the moment the creditors line up, clip coupons, and calculate reparations like late fees. Then comes the aftermath, and it is not gentle. The Treaty of Versailles reads like a bill. Reparations imposed, payment schedules implied. Economic punishment designed to keep Germany down, but also to satisfy the victors' ledgers. This is another foreclosure scene, stretched across a continent. The defeated are told to sign. They sign because they have no choice, and because without signatures there is no trade, no credit, no reconstruction. The pen becomes a weapon more permanent than artillery. Reconstruction is sold as healing. It is also another cycle of loans. Capital flows back in, often from the same financial houses that financed destruction. That is the loop. Finance funds war, then funds rebuilding, then collects from both phases. Let that number sink in, even if it's uncomfortable. War can make fortunes without producing a single useful object. It turns steel into scrap and calls it GDP. It turns young men into graves and calls it sacrifice. It is the most expensive form of consumption. In the 1920s, the debts don't vanish. They mutate. Germany's payments become international issues. Exchange rates become political crises. Hyperinflation becomes a kind of social amputation, cutting off the middle class from stability. A generation grows up learning one lesson. Paper promises can kill you. Not with bullets, but with rent you can't pay and bread you can't buy. That is how financial trauma becomes political extremism. Fear is a currency, too. Decades later, investigators and committees try to name the pattern. They look at arms makers, bankers, commissions, contracts, influence. They search for a single villain and find a system instead. A machine that rewards conflict and punishes restraint. And systems are harder to jail than men. Systems hide inside procedures, inside normal finance, inside the phrase, "It's just business." But war is never just business to the dead. It is only business to those far from the mud. So did bankers secretly start World War I? The honest answer is complicated, but the thriller answer is sharper. Bankers didn't fire the first shot. They didn't write the ultimatum. But they built the rails that carried the mobilization money. They made the arms race affordable. They made the long war sustainable. They made peace inconvenient. They created incentives. And in history, incentives are often stronger than ideology. Here is the core philosophy, the one you should carry out of this story. History is not only decided by armies or politicians. It is decided by accountants, debt, and resources. The ledger is the real battlefield map. When the money runs out, empires fall fast. When credit freezes, alliances crack. When gold leaves, confidence dies. When insolvency arrives, speeches become noise. Sovereignty is solvency, and a nation that can't pay becomes a client. The tragedy is that the architecture built in that era didn't disappear. Central banking matured. War bond campaigns became normal. Military procurement became a permanent river of contracts. The merger of finance and state power became standard operating procedure. Today, we like to believe we're more modern, more informed, more immune. But the machine is still here, just cleaner, more technical, better branded. The merchants of death didn't vanish. They refined their paperwork. So next time you hear that World War I began because of a single assassination, remember the quieter trigger, the balance sheets already trembling, the bankers already positioned, the credit already flowing toward the furnace. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that treat history like a crime scene and money like the fingerprint, subscribe to the channel. Stay ahead of the people still watching parades, while the ledger decides the next catastrophe in silence.